So this is Change Your Local Agriculture, community conversation. So essentially, we really want to have, I mentioned Roger's Grower Circle he has every Wednesday, and that is really a group of folks from around, particularly in San Juan Island here, but it does happen other places. Bring in your coffee and have a discussion around the table. And that's what we're trying to facilitate today. You know, whether you're a farmer, a gardener, producer, owner, operator, leasee, if you're involved in land management in some way, shape, or form, you guys matter to this conversation. We're trying to break this up into 20-minute conversations for each topic, looking on terms of how we are adapting to changes in the weather. A lot of rain this past winter. What are people doing to kind of accommodate that? Climate change, drought, you name it. Responding to different markets as a result of COVID is probably the classic example there. Are there new customer demands that we're seeing as time goes by? Could it be related to COVID? Could it be related to the economy? Whatnot? And an opportunity to share resources. Labor and housing has been a real common topic lately. Equipment usage, whatever. So what's out there that people are doing to utilize local resources to kind of be able to, you know, pull this off on a year-to-year basis, more or less. And so I'm going to take this off, stop share, and I will turn it over to Roger, who will facilitate this for everyone. And there you go.
Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome.
This model is based on what we were doing at the San Juan Island Grange, originally at the Grange Hall. And so it was almost a round table. It's actually a nice big square of rectangular tables. And we called it the Grower Circle Coffee Hour, but I recognize that several folks actually drink tea. And so I'm going to say this is the herbal tea coffee hour and a half. And this is similarly arranged. So what we're going to do is just throw out these 4 questions, and I'm going to start with the one where, have growing conditions been really rough the past couple of years? We had a heat dome, we've had crazy rain, we've had beautiful balmy weather and then cold snaps. So I'd like to know how folks have changed their practices or responded to these. Is there a friendly person who wants to start off?
One quick question for you, Roger. Would you like folks to raise their hands or type in the chat?
Okay. I'm used to the idea that people will raise an eyebrow and I'll call on them, but I see very few actual faces here. So I might have to rely on a chat monitor. And I'm going to put the chat open. And if you do want to raise a hand, either digitally, the way Zoom has nice yellow hands that you can raise, or you can do it if you're on my screen. When I have 24 people on my screen, you can do this, and I usually recognize that as a sign that you'd like to chat, speak. How about you, Brooke? Have you changed anything in your practices? And you can actually defer to Bruce because he's got a hand up if you want to.
Gosh, I'll defer to Bruce.
All right.
Yeah, well, one thing, Roger, that I've definitely been doing the last few years is to do a lot more starts than I used to. I used to do a lot of direct seed, and it seems to me like because it gets dry so early that if I can get those plants growing in the greenhouse or in the inside the house a little bit earlier, and then get them transplanted while the soil still has some moisture in it, I don't have to irrigate so much, and that has helped a lot. Getting some of those crops, such as beans, that I do their final stage early enough that they don't get wet and moldy. So that's one thing I've done differently.
Thanks, Bruce. Does it take an elaborate or expensive greenhouse to do that?
Well, mine's not. It's not heated. No, it's just against the house, and it just brings the temperature up enough that things will survive if we get a cold snap.
Thank you for that. Any other responses to the weather, variable weather conditions? Henning, how about you? And you are muted.
The most difficult thing for us during the winter has been to feed the animals without pugging the soils. So we did something we had never done before, which is that we housed about 3 dozen sheep inside various places in barns and fed them there. It took some management to do this, but they seem to be thriving on hay and some grain supplement. We couldn't do that for the cows, so the cows are still outside, and we moved them rapidly through small paddocks so that we can feed them there, essentially below a temporary fence line. And they feed in front and they excrete behind, and I'm still able to fertilize the entire field by moving those paddocks every 3 days. But still, I see a certain amount of pugging that worries me. I hope that we're not going to get as much rain next year, because I think in the long run, this cannot be beneficial either for the soils or for the animals, unless you have barns big enough to house them all winter inside.
Henning, it sounds like you were describing a sheep tractor.
Well, it's not really a sheep tractor. The sheep are inside in the barn all winter. I have three areas. There's an area for rams, an area for unbred ewe lambs, and an area for bred ewes. Obviously, you don't want to mix those three. And they have their feeders, and I give them hay and I give them a grain supplement. So that works actually quite nicely, but it's the first time for me to have done that. I mean, I've been running sheep for what, 40 years? And this is the first time I fed sheep inside in the winter. I usually was able to feed them outside all winter with no damage to the soil and no harm to the animals. But since January, we have had almost twice the rain we get all year in just 2 months. So that's been quite a challenge. And I can't do that for the cows because I don't have additional barns big enough to house the cows. So they're still outside, but I move them rapidly through small areas that I change every 3 days. So that's pretty labor intensive, but it accomplishes the goal of fertilizing the fields at the same time that I feed the animals. Because that's how I provide fertility, is through animal excrement. So I'm concerned about the pugging, and I'm concerned about the health effects of the wet, cold weather on the animals. And I guess I'm praying to the weather gods to change their behavior.
Yeah, thanks. Bruce, you've got some experience with sheep.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. So I'm such a data nerd, I've got to admit, and my farm has been part of the Cocoa Ross Network, which is the rain monitoring network, which is a volunteer organization since 2009. And so I just wanted to throw out some stats for you. Last summer, we went from a fairly nice spring, nice warm, occasional showers in May, and then by June we were in that heat dome. And June 24th here at Mitchell Bay Farm, it was 104 degrees. And I had to tell you, irrigating a permanent perennial orchard, the 186 trees, you're pouring the water on all the time, and so much is lost through evapotranspiration. It was such a challenge. But we made it through that, and we had good crop results. Then, of course, we had the typical September rain start, but then when November hit, we had the highest rain that I have seen historically at this farm since 1989. We had 11.53 inches of rain in November. And then followed by December, in which we had multiple snowstorms, but a total water equivalent for December was 10 inches. So right there in that 2 months, that's 21.53 inches of rain. That's a lot of water, considering that most of the islands average between 26 and 28 inches per year. That, of course, depends upon where you're at in the rain shadow. So then February hits and we go through this kind of quasi dry period, which has got everybody's getting their hopes up. It's like, oh, this is going to be nice. And then boom, another atmospheric river drops another inch on us. So now we're up to 22.5 inches. Now realize that the water year, the way that precipitation is measured over time, starts in October 31st, 2021 was the beginning of new water year. That water year ends October 30th, 2022. So that means that we have roughly 6 inches more rain to come, but we only have probably 4 months to get it. When will we get it? Will we get it in May? Will we get it in April? And then all of a sudden things start to dry out May, June, July, August. And if we're lucky, we'll get some more starting in mid-September and October, and boom, we're at the end of the water year. So I have a feeling that it's going to be a very interesting year, and who knows what's going to happen. But Henning, I hear you about the pugging issue. A lot of people have been experiencing that, and all I can say is that having heavy use areas that are covered is a blessing, because especially if you've got a hard surface underneath that, and you can pick up all that waste material, all the waste manure, all the bedding, and compost it and get it back out on the land later. And there's a lot of farms that have really experienced the benefits of that. And not only that, but their livestock tend to gain better and more poundage because they're not wasting all that energy trying to keep warm in a wet, cold environment. All right, that's it. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Yeah, some folks have described new systems of tillage and no tillage in order to keep a good soil structure. And Nootka Rose just chatted that going to a no-till system really helped us for the dry summer. Nootka Rose, do you want to elaborate on that? If you're willing to do it verbally, that would be swell.
Oh, okay, here we are.
Good, we can hear you now.
Okay, good. Yeah, we went to no-till 3 years ago, I guess. And during the hot, dry summer, our irrigation didn't go up, or the amount of water we used didn't really go up.
That much.
There was very little meltdown in the garden on a hot, sunny afternoon. And then when we got all that rain in November, there was very little puddling in the garden.
We'll continue. Yeah, up through this winter, there's been very little standing water, where I generally see over the years, we've seen standing water in our cultivated ground, now no-till ground. But where we grow the vegetables, that has really seemed to have gone away miraculously. I can't explain why, except that it was no-till. So this was a good year to test the no-till against adverse water conditions or lack of. And we recorded out here on Waldron between the beginning of March last year and the middle of September, 3.5 inches. And then, yeah, the winter through the middle of September through the end of December, well over 25 inches of rain.
And we missed some of that snow because we weren't home.
So it sounds like your no-till systems deal with both drought and too much water.
Correct.
Yeah,
Sounds great.
very much so. And I think that if you talk to other people, they would find that they also are finding the regulation, the soil regulates itself much better.
Well, let's ask other folks. Have other people had that experience with a no-till system, or maybe a heavily mulched system?
Yeah, I think that we have over here for sure.
And Henning, do you have a place to put all your wonderful litter, bedding, manure?
Well, this is why I really prefer to have the animals deposit directly on the ground in the winter while they're feeding, because then I don't have to move it 2 or 3 times. That has proven a very reliable way to get fertility back to the fields on an annual basis. It's just more difficult this year because of the great wetness. But I agree with Nootka Rose that the areas that have either had a cover crop on it or have not been tilled don't show any puddling. And I was really impressed when I traveled the Skagit Valley recently, and I could see that all the fields that had been tilled looked like lakes or rivers, while those that were cover cropped or covered in some other way didn't show any puddling at all. So you might say that what I experienced in my microcosmic farm is verified by the much larger farms, you know, in the Skagit Valley. That seems to be generally true, that if you have a cover, a soil cover, you're going to be able to handle water, excess water, much better. However, if you have cows on it and they break the soil, well, then in a way you're tilling. And so the only way I deal with that is by moving the animals quickly. I don't allow them to be in one area for more than 3 days.
Okay, yes, breaking down structure and compacting
Right.
from animal hooves. In the chat, Nootka Roses asked how they moved into no-till. Can you explain that for us?
See, we moved into it by just parking the tractor in the rototiller. It took a commitment, and it took a long period of trying to overcome training and culture. But yeah, you just don't till. It means you have to rethink how you manage your farm, what you're managing your farm for. You have to get used to a totally new aesthetic. And again, no-till has a very fluid definition. I mean, we do a little bit of soil disturbance with row openers, so that we can cut a slit through crop residues and cover crops, so that and plant into that.
We started by purchasing some silage tarps and using those, which made, you know, and we also had we had weed barrier. We used this landscape cloth, and we use a lot of mulch. And between those 3 things, we're able to manage pretty well. We've tried, it's a work in progress, let's say, but we saw so many immediate results in improved plant vigor and soil and water retention and flavor and all kinds of things that
Crop uniformity.
Yeah, crop uniformity. It was just kind of what you'd say a no-brainer, even though we've been cultivating, tilling the soil, you know, for over 35 years. And one thing that spurred us on to try this was just the knowledge that we started to begin, you know, we started gaining from working with soil scientists, Tom DeLuca and Doug Collins, and just listening to some no-till podcasts on the radio. And it inspired us to give it a try. After we started making biochar quite a few years ago and putting that on the soil, so that, you know, the obvious thing is we're feeding something down there in the soil, and let's figure out what it is and what can we do to help those microorganisms. So one of the major things was don't disturb their home, basically, because what's the point if you're just dumping biochar in to help them build their homes, and then you go along and you disturb them. So anyway, that was it. That was kind of our inspiration. So we just listened to some podcasts to find out and watched some videos to find out how other people that had been doing it much longer than we had were doing it.
And so one of the convincing arguments was we laid out all our soil tests over the decades and tracked the organic matter content. And during the initial couple of decades of farming this ground, organic matter was slowly coming up. And then it plateaued out and hasn't really changed much since. And I mentioned this to Tom DeLuca, and he just said, well, try cutting out the tillage. And he was right.
So I notice that Andrew Borner is in the audience here. And Andrew, can you tell us some of the benefits of biochar in a living soil structure and system?
Sure. Thanks. Basically biochar is a good way to increase the water holding capacity and nutrient holding capacity of the soil. Shouldn't be thought of as a nutrient because it's essentially just a well-made biochar doesn't have any kind of labile nutrients in it or not much. So it's really just a framework, a really high surface area framework to hold on to nutrients and water. And it provides a great habitat for microbes and fungi. So, you know, I've put biochar out in the garden and then gone back just after the, you know, annual growing season back in the fall, and like you can, if you didn't, you know, work the biochar in super evenly, you can see that the roots migrate to the kind of clumps of biochar or where it's more concentrated. And, you know, I really think that's because it's probably here in our climate, mainly because it's holding on to a water longer in the season. So, you know, I think it's really beneficial for both, you know, water and nutrient holding capacity, and it benefits the structure of the soil as well. Like, you know, especially if you're not tilling it, you know, you're going to be getting those soil aggregates, and the root exudates are going to be, you know, forming those conglomerates and you know a good healthy growing medium for your garden. So that's sort of the that's the quick of it. And you know that's sort of the benefit to the farmer, but you know there's also this whole carbon sequestration story behind it as well. It's a very long-lived high quality carbon material. So it's going to be around. Well-made biochar, high carbon biochar is going to be around for hundreds, potentially thousands of years. So when you make biochar and put it in the soil, it's going to be there for a long time. So it's a big for me, a big part of the story of biochar is the climate aspect of it as well.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Listen, I want to point out to folks that there's a very good little conversation going on under the table in the chat feature. So they're talking about whether you have to till in biochar and how are the worms doing in this system. And so those folks who want to continue talking about that, chat away in the chat feature, but we're going to move on the surface up here on the blackboard. We're going to talk about how have folks responded to changing markets. And we know that COVID really shut down access to some markets. And if you were relying on the sales of your produce, how did that affect you? And how did you respond to that? I need somebody who sells produce to the world. I was part of the food hub, for instance. I was on the board for the San Juan Island Food Hub, and we made a very quick pivot from wholesale to retail. It was originally designed as a wholesale food hub. And then suddenly we had a demand for people to pick up produce in a safe way. So we just packaged bags and handed them to our customers through the door, a window of their cars. And that's how the Food Hub got its start in the retail world. Christine, what's on your mind? There you go.
I felt very fortunate that I had a similar, I sold mostly to direct sales to restaurants here on Lopez. And our food bank here did a similar thing that the Food Hub did. They leapt into action and became very devoted to the idea of being able to source as much food from Lopez as possible, and also regionally. And so I was able to, instead of selling to the restaurants, I was able to just shift right over and start selling to the food bank, to our, what we call it, a food share program. So I'm grateful to them, and that continues on. I think it'll be interesting to see how we move forward, because certainly there was a lot of funding available to get some of these things going. So they were sort of, actually during COVID, were fairly flush and were able to really spend generously. And that may change as some of those supports fall away.
Great, thank you. Anybody else with a little personal experience on that? And I imagine that with restrictions going down, people are going to feel much more comfortable shopping at the grocery stores, and so maybe local farms can actually take advantage of the fact that people are also comfortable going to restaurants, and so maybe the market will just shift over. Henning, I saw you raising your hand. Thank you for
Well,
that.
I just wanted to add to what Christine just said. The Family Resource Center asked us whether we could grow certain produce for the food bank, and we did. We actually engaged two people, one of whom grew potatoes and the other one grew strawberries and green vegetables, and delivered that produce for pay, which they took. The farm didn't need the money, so the people we engaged, they did this for their own risk and profit, which means they got the money. And so it worked for everybody's benefit. And again, like Christine, I hope that there will be continuation of funding of such initiatives, because there are a lot of people who don't have enough money to put good nutritionally whole food on their plates. And it makes me feel good if not just people with deep pockets, but everybody has access to nutritionally whole, fresh, locally grown produce.
Great, thank you. Olivia, you're the wholesale coordinator for the San Juan Islands Food Hub. You have something to say about this?
Yeah, I just want to offer, as we talk about potentially other markets transitioning, I just want to touch on two different funding sources that are always available to farmers. And the first one is that there's a lot of money on the table within the state of Washington for farm to school. And I know that that's been touched on in previous sessions, but that does require a GAP certification. And then the other one is a program called We Feed Washington, which allows food banks to buy local food and provides the budget for that. That's coming up on its second year, and the San Juan Island Food Hub is a subcontractor for that program through the Puget Sound Food Hub. So I'm hopeful in the second year of that grant, there is a larger budget for inter-island food sales. And what I mean by that is the big limiting issue with that program is that island farmers can't compete with the price points that Puget Sound producers were able to meet, obviously with a higher cost of everything on the islands. So yeah, those are definitely two different funding sources to look out for. And then just the San Juan Island Food Hub has funding for people to get Produce Safety Alliance certified, as well as a potential to do group GAP as well. And those are both food safety programs that we have funding for people to complete. So just wanted to throw that out there as an additional resource.
That's great. So can small operators benefit from this program if they, especially if they have the funding paid by you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now there's a Produce Safety Alliance training in March in Anacortes, and for members of the San Juan Island Food Hub, we cover the cost of that class as well as the transportation over to Anacortes.
Sounds great. Thank you. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Olivia, would you mind just entering that information about those two funding programs in the chat for any kind of contact info for folks if they wish to pursue that?
Absolutely, I will.
Great, thank you.
That's great. So I hear several ways that we adapted, maybe moving toward a food hub. Did people expand their, say, gate sales? I know I did. I sold a lot of fruit trees and eggs directly at my gate. It was really easy to put in a little box. People put money in the jar and took the thing they wanted from the bench at my gate, and they didn't even have to walk onto my property, and we could wave, try to recognize each other through the masks. I think it worked pretty well. Anybody with that kind of experience? Go ahead, Henning.
We had a lot of people asking us for meat and eggs. And one impediment was that the mobile unit couldn't come to the island this winter because of no ferries running. So a lot of our animals didn't get butchered when they were supposed to, which is one of the reasons I had so many sheep this year, more than usual, which I had to hold over. Hopefully this season they'll get butchered. I'm just mentioning this, that there was a lot of activity, people asking, do you have meat? Do you have eggs? And we sold what we could, but we could have sold more if we had had more. If in fact the mobile unit could have come and butchered and, you know, up to supply. So I just want to put that out there, that was a difficulty this past season.
Mm. Yeah, and I know an organization got started, let's see if I can get it right, Island Poultry Resiliency Collaborative, the IPRC.
Mm-hmm.
And Bruce Robinson was part of the founding of that. Bruce, do you feel like talking to us about eggs and chickens and young chicks and incubators and hatching systems?
Yeah, well, we were hoping that with COVID and the lack of ability to get chicks on island, oftentimes that we might have better success if we were able to hatch our own. And we were hoping that we would maybe come up with a set of characteristics that are really well suited for the islands. And we've had some people using our equipment and having success getting some chicks, new chicks coming in for themselves. And one of those would be Spring Street School. And so it's educational as well as helpful for self-reliance and so on. Anyway, we do have a good number of incubators available if people are interested in borrowing one. And they can always contact me or Roger at the Grange.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I want to talk to Rob Rock. Do you mind pitching in, Rob, and tell us, is there a demand for local chicken meat on this island? And you are muted. You can also decline and I'll move on. Okay, give it some thought. One of the things that we talked about in putting together our questions was whether customers are changing their demands or expectations lately. And oh, I'm sorry, Rob. Rob's on a computer that doesn't have a mic or a camera, so he's going to be listening in. Okay, thanks for that. And Rob, you can actually type, it looks like, so you can put something in the chat if you want to. So how are customers changing? Like I said, I got a lot of phone calls from people who were looking for fresh eggs, and they were willing to come up to my gate. And I think the best operation was to put them on a schedule and just to say, yes, I can provide for you a couple dozen per week, but I can't take on any more customers for a while. Okay, and Olivia just put the links for the Food Hub and her own personal email on the chat. So how are customers changing their expectations or demands? Anybody feel like joining in on that? Bruce Gregory, do you have customers?
Yeah, I just slow and pushing the mic on. So in respect to our enterprise, which is grass-fed lamb, what I've noticed the last couple of years is that, you know, we've maintained a customer list of 30 to 35 households for the last 25 plus years. And what I find happening now is a lot of those customers that generally buy a whole lamb from us now are deferring and going to an every other year schedule. And a problematic situation is that, you know, we used to offer halves all the time, but it became really, really difficult to orchestrate, you know, the cut and wrap through IGFC for halves. And so what we did was we essentially told our customers, hey, you know, if you don't want a whole lamb and you want a half, find somebody to share the other half. And that's worked pretty well. But then there was also the customer that basically said, well, because of the cost of meat has really gone up, we're just going to nurse that one lamb we bought from you last year through 2 years. And then we say, okay, that's cool. We'll come back to you, you know, year after next. And I've seen that a lot. And I don't know whether other meat production producers have experienced that or not, but that's been a real interesting take home for us. And then a lot of that, you know, is of course, because of the constant lifting in prices that we have to pay as producers for all the inputs, you know, whether it's, you know, seed, fertilizer, power, fuel, the actual processing costs, feed costs. If you're, you know, the smart farmer is going to use, you know, a pretty good concentrated feed source if they're raising animals that are going through gestation periods, because you want to maintain that growth. So all those things, and then transportation, of course, with the ferry. So there's all this, you know, because we're in a geographically challenged area, all these issues kind of come in and hover over you and kind of affect what you can and can't do. And so that, of course, causes a rise in prices. And that's, I think we're going to have to live with that. It's just the way it is. I wish there was easy answers.
Thank you, Bruce. I think Henning was saying he had a similar experience. Less meat demanded. Is that right?
I found that actually people, like today, I got 2 messages, people saying, we need lamb. Can you supply us now, or when will you butcher? And that's because there was a delay in the winter because the mobile unit couldn't come here because there were no ferries running. So that's been a real impediment, and not just for us, I think for a lot of people, is that we couldn't get timely butchering. So we had to hold animals over. Okay, so I guess they're not going to be lamb, they're going to be mutton. They'll be just as good, you know, most consumers can't really tell the difference. But I know that people want the meat. Price has never really been a problem for us, maybe because we probably sell at the low end anyway, quite deliberately, because we want people to have access to the food. So I'm always hoping that local farmers will feed the local population first before they export. That we emphasize the local market if at all possible. The same with feed.
That would be a good segue to the final question, but I was thinking in this customer demand, if we had more people who would accept animals on the hoof, they can do their own butchering. Maybe we need to train more people to and have them sharpen their knives. Does that seem ridiculous to you folks?
Well, you can't control their approach to that unless, you know, there's some science behind it and some, you know, some sort of, you know, I hate to say it, but some kind of health regulation associated with that. You don't know who's going to do the butchering and how they've been trained, if at all. It, you know, it kind of brings up those kinds of issues, unfortunately. But I hear what Henning's saying, and, you know, I know a lot of farms that have been affected by the lack of, you know, the mobile unit because of the ferry system. It's just another indication of what we've had to live through these last 2 years, especially this last year, as COVID really seemed to hit the ferry system a lot harder than it did the year before. And, you know, yeah, there's a lot of animals out there that are just being held over.
Didn't I heard recently that the situation is changing, that processing plant on the mainland is going to be larger, and the mobile unit will be able to spend more time with us.
Yeah, you know, IGFC's gone through a $1.3 million expansion, the first it's ever done. So we've left the PEF facility on the RC Road that we've been with since the year 2000. It's been, you know, an astronomically successful transfer, and it's just awesome. The issue now is that there's so much need on the mainland producers that are in the co-op that we've kind of had to push forward. You know, there was initially the idea of putting a kill floor in so that it would give access to the processing for the mainland users who could basically transport their animals on site to the facility. And that actually has come up to a point now where there's some glimmer in the end here that the financial tunnel has been opened up, and there's actually some state and federal money that's out there that IGFC has applied for a grant to actually implement the kill floor section of their new facility. And so that's going to really take a lot of pressure off the mobile unit, because as it is now, the mobile unit has to service all of those 54 producers within the 4-5 county area. And it's, you know, logistic nightmare. So it's actually become the new log jam, so to speak, in that it was before the log jam was the size of the facility at Bow. We could only throughput so much through that unit. And the mobile unit now has become the other log jam because it can't get out there. So the kill floor is going to be a really good, kind of alleviate a lot of that pressure, I think. And so it's great. And it's gone through all of its, you know, the rigorous requirements for safety and a new HACCP plan. The county has okayed it for its, you know, siting there, and it's all looking good. So if the money comes through with the big grant, that's going to be a happening thing, which will be really, really beneficial to all the livestock producers. And maybe we'll be able to see an increase in the number of those producers as the co-op finally is able to grow more.
Great, thank you. Henning?
You know, I'm glad that they're working on enlarging facilities to throughput more animals. I'm a little concerned about reverting to a kill floor on the large scale, because the mobile unit was developed right here on Lopez in order not to have to ship animals to kill floors. Okay, because it's a form of animal abuse, you know, to put them on the trailer and ship them a long distance to a kill floor. And I worked in a meat plant for a year, and I've seen what happens to the animals and how they suffer. And having a mobile unit that goes from farm to farm and butchers animals that were born and raised on that farm is a much more humane way to provide us with meat. So it's really ironic that the mobile unit, which was developed on the islands for the islands, is now serving a much larger market, and we are reverting to kill floors in order to meet that market demand. I would hope that we could develop more mobile units and kill the animals on the farms, bring them to the plant for processing instead of assembling animals in holding pens. If you want to see what happens at such a plant, there are some plants nearby, and they're supposed to be really modern, but they still make me shudder when I think about what the animals go through before they finally become meat.
I would like to jump in, Bruce.
I just want to say that won't affect the mobile unit coming out here. If anything, it'll increase the location and arrival situation as long as the ferry plays along. The kill floor is only going to be for those mainland producers that want to use that facility. There's nobody going to force those members to use it.
I agree.
There's still going to be users on the mainland that want to use the mobile unit, because that's the philosophical basis of ITFC, was
that's right.
That level of farm visit kind of slaughter.
That's right.
Stress.
Oh, good.
I agree with you, and I'm glad. Thank you.
And this is a great segue, because the last one is in what way can we collaborate and cooperate, share resources? And I see the IGFC as a really successful model. It's a way of pooling resources to get infrastructure that actually travels from farm to farm, the mobile unit. And I'm wondering what other kinds of things. Bruce Robinson talked about the IPRC, which is the sharing of equipment for hatching and brooding replacement chicks for egg flocks. Are there other examples of ways that we can work together, help each other? Anybody?
Well, I know over here on San Juan, this last 4-H production season, there was a really, really big concerted effort. Adam Green, Oakwood Farm, got the Zilch lease from the land bank for 2 years, and they collaborated with a whole group of small farms and medium-sized farms to go out and get that harvest done. It was really cool, because there was one time there was like 4 tractors running at one time. One would cut, one would rake, one would bale, and the 4th one would wrap those small railway bales and turn them into haylage. And that worked out really well, and they're going to actually expand that and get more of the acreage done this year. Like many things, that's a really time-critical process, and everybody has to do it at the same time. So it's a really tough thing to be able to share the equipment that does that and move that equipment around. But if you have one large site that everybody can collaborate on, it's a really great success story. And I think that's going to be what we'll see more and more of, maybe.
And you said that was that happened last harvest season, at Zylstra Lake.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I heard that. I live right next to Zylstra Lake, and I love listening to the haying over there. So that was a good thing. Are there other examples? Oh, equipment. Bruce, don't pieces of hay equipment all have, aren't they all demanded at exactly the same time?
Pretty much. I mean, if you're only into hay, then, of course, like most of the old timers always say, well, we never cut any hay until around the 4th of July. Well, when new technologies, came into being, and we started, getting European-based systems like the haylage system, where we could actually go out into a field in late April or mid-May if it's dry enough, and get that crop off the ground and get those bales in bale form and get them wrapped within 24 hours so they go through an silage process. We're able to get a better crop because there's more fertility in it, because it hasn't gone to boot. we're able to start earlier, which means if you then want to translate into doing hay to follow up on another field, that extends your season. And the problem with that, though, is if everybody's doing either haylage or doing hay, then you're basically tying that equipment to the land base that's involved in that production. And so if you have a whole bunch of farms that want to do that at the same time, how do you solve the problem of making sure the equipment can get to every place? And that's why, you know, a lot of the folks that have done custom hay businesses, you know, struggle with that. It's really, really an awful thing sometimes. I mean, I can remember the first 20 years of my farming here on the island that we used to buy local hay, and we were lucky to get stuff that was cut in August. And I'd put out a bale of hay and my sheep would paw through it and leave 2/3 of it because it's like feeding straw. There was no nutrition in it, nothing. It was terrible. That's why I made the decision to get out of that racket and do my own thing.
And your own thing was haylage. And does that actually have a wider, longer window of harvest opportunity?
Well, it depends on how you approach it. Personally, I think that the best window for me is probably the second to third week of May. And that window starts to close towards the end of May. And I guess this is site specific, of course, because there are so many microclimates out here that what one field is doing because it's one soil type might be different than the farm over here that's a different soil type. But the key to it is to basically try to stop the maturity of that grass. And one strategy that's worked really well for us is if a field gets away from us, we'll take a flail mower into it, set it really high so that it just chops the top off. And then we'll go in and we'll mow it with a drum mower, put it in the windrow, and then go in and harvest it and bale it up and then wrap it. So you kind of catch it later, but you know, and as you do that, of course, the nutritional value goes down as that seed head forms. But it's a way around the problem. But you can only do that for so many acres, and depending upon how much equipment you have and how many people are there to help you do it.
Are there other examples of limited equipment availability or infrastructure that slows people down?
Absolutely.
Like what? What do you have in mind?
Well, what Bruce is talking about works really well for especially small scale acreage. If you have neighbors, either you have the equipment yourself or neighbors are willing to work with you. So normally what we do is we watch the weather report and we find a 3-day window, and we cut one day and we rake the next and we bale and put it in the barn at the latest by the 3rd day. So by the time it comes into the barn, it is fresh and you can cut the hay early so you get not just the stem, but leafy material. And that really makes really a superior hay. But I find that only works on the small scale. You know, if you have huge fields, big farms, then you're running into an equipment problem. So that's a perpetual problem on all the islands. Who are the neighbors? I mean, we used to have a baler, now our baler's gone. So I'm working with somebody else who does have a small baler. We do our own cutting and raking. But we work mostly with the weather report and try to get that hay into the barn, from cutting to in the barn within 60 hours. That seems to be the key.
Great, thanks. My experience is through cider apples. I know that harvest can be through the season, and then cider apples are actually allowed to sit for a while, but eventually comes a time when you want to have that pressing party. And everybody has those little screw presses, and very few people have the larger ones that the commercial people use. And the Grange has been talking about buying a medium-sized one so that we can all pitch in, maybe take the press to various farms, or maybe we could all just take the apples to a central location. Are there other examples where people can help each other? And it doesn't have to be all about equipment, but it could be housing, labor. I mean, do people actually share apprentices and workers?
This is Marcy with the Makers Guild. I'm working on the project to do the housing survey. And I was thinking about housing in terms of mobile units in this conversation. And one of the things that we'd like to learn from the community, either through the survey or otherwise, is whether or not there would be an interest in a nonprofit getting funding from the USDA to create a sort of a fleet of tiny houses that are mobile, and whether or not the type of agriculture happening could use seasonal housing, or would everybody all need housing all at the same time? And the caveat on that, of course, would be that there would have to be utility hookup, but it would help farmers not have to invest in the cost of the housing if there was some type of a nonprofit that was in charge of maintaining the housing. And just wonder what people's thoughts on that might be.
What a great idea. Would they be built on this island with local wood and local materials?
That would certainly be ideal if we can find builders that'll do it for less than $300 a square foot.
Mhm. Marcy, will you put your contact information in the chat?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. And I also put a link to the actual survey that we're doing right now to try and sort of quantify what the housing needs are, because it's clear in every conversation we're having that the labor shortage is really foundationally impacted by the lack of housing. So whatever size farm operation you have, we really would appreciate some feedback on that. And that if you guys could copy that one out. Thanks. But any comments on the idea of a fleet of movable housing?
Yes, will it fit other people's agricultural models is one of the questions. Will it work here?
I would say if we could get the county to allow us to do that, and if there is a desire upon the farms who want to do that, and really this drops back into the question of, we've got quite a bit of agricultural land that's being held and monitored and basically leased out on a per, small lease, 5 to 10 year leases by the land bank. But those properties don't allow housing. And that's always been one of the problems with them trying to find leaseholders who can afford to work those lands. You don't see the young farmers doing that because there's no opening for them to do it. And big lack of housing is a big issue.
Right, yeah. I want to hear from Christine.
I think it's a great idea. I think it's an example of thinking outside the box, almost literally the movable box. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I also wanted to comment on your question about sharing workers, and I have quite a bit of experience having done that over the years. I've shared interns who have come, been recruited and supported by the land trust here, and who have worked a couple days a week on my farm and a couple days a week on somebody else's farm. And they've always done an amazing job of being able to match up, the desires of the person, what they want to learn, what specific kind of operation they're interested in participating in, and then providing a real diversity of experience for them and also for us as the farmers. And it created a really interesting and fruitful bridge kind of between the farms that were sharing a worker, because you know how it is, you get working and we don't see each other that often. And it was really fun to have maybe an intern going back and forth between the two farms, and on a couple of occasions we actually sort of codified the process, and we would ask each other questions via the intern, because it was fun to sort of hear how the information was shared, and then how it was digested by the intern, and then how it came back. And some of it was production related, and some of it was just sort of silly fun, but it turned out to be a really beautiful experience to be sharing folks between the farms.
Christine, can you tell us the name of your farm?
Oh, my farm is Lopez Harvest. I'm on Lopez, And I've been growing produce here for, maybe about 25 years, I guess. There I am.
Great. Oh, there you are.
More than
Hello.
that.
Okay, Allison, you have a response to that? And you are muted.
Okay. I just wanted to mention that we don't have to limit ourselves to things like tiny houses. Now, I personally, before I got my house built, was living in my Volkswagen van, little camper van, which I could consider renting out for, a modest fee. And then I also spent quite a bit of time in my land boat, also known as field boat. And that's a small thing that could be hauled around with a trailer, if somebody had the trailer, to wherever it was needed. And then there was no power to it, but the camper van did have a propane stove, so I could cook. And then the other piece of it is the outhouse, which I call the in-house because it's too pretty. And that actually is something I got permitted by the county, and it involves a slow compost process and some limits on what you can do with the product, but then you wind up, doing something useful with your product. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of open the idea that there are otherwise, especially for summer workers who aren't going to have to deal with cold weather. Things like camper vans, maybe even tents, boats, field boats, so sort of open your mind and think about it, and I'd be happy to talk to people about details. So.
Yes, thank you. Nathan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Great. Yeah. So my wife and I own Barn Owl Bakery, and we farm a bit of grain over here on Lopez Island. And I think the tiny house thing is great. What we're running into right now with help on the farm and bakery is wages. The trades in the island, the wages have all gone way up recently, and I think there's a sense among a lot of workers right now that they want to get paid very well, which is great, and I've got no problem with that. But we're trying to figure out how to pay everybody in the bakery, 25 to 30 bucks an hour, which is a big jump. But if we, want people to help us, that's kind of what, we're having to compete against with, landowners and businesses that can pay people a lot more than food businesses. So I'm curious, the other farms, how they're dealing with that, and, what kind of wages they're looking at paying people for, the 2022 growing season. And, we try to offer incentives, and it's like we try to make it a fun place to work, but at the same time, we do want to pay people a living wage, that they can afford to pay rent, or, whatever here in the islands. So there's that piece. And then, equipment sharing. I just want to give a huge shout out to, the farmers and Steve Lillistahl, especially over here on Lopez, to do the grain thing. We share a lot of equipment and a lot of expertise, because there's a lot of steps to that, specifically in the cleaning process and the storage process. And so I think, if someone's interested in doing grain, it's really hard to get all the equipment together on your own to do it. And it's a situation, I think, where it does make a lot of sense to share some equipment.
Yes.
Anyway, that's all I had to say.
Thank you for that. I want to ask Christine, your hand is still up, or is it up again?
I guess it's still up. I guess it didn't go away. I thought it usually went away.
Here's a chance to speak if you want to.
I don't actually have anything to add to the conversation at this point. Thank you.
That's great. Okay. And Andrew, you had your hand up for a while and now it's down. So what's up, Andrew?
I just wanted to comment on the tiny house thing. I think the housing situation is a huge issue in the San Juans, like all of us do. But I'm wondering, and I'm interested in tiny houses, but I wonder if it's just more of a stopgap measure, because if you're a farm, and it's a small, if there's funding for a small fleet of tiny houses that move around, if you're a farm, you're going to need labor again next year. So like, I wonder if funding for permanent kind of smaller on-farm housing is really a a more permanent solution, or if the tiny house thing, it could be used more of as a a stopgap measure for the time being. I wonder if what the reactions are to that.
Great, thanks. And I wanted to point out that, let's see, who was it in the chat? Monica, when considering temporary housing, you need to think about how you're going to manage the septic system. Well, I'm glad that Andrew was speaking, because I think biochar is a great way to handle human waste. And it would be great if the county would recognize that any farm with a good farm plan and a nutrient plan can handle all the solid waste it needs to without actually putting together a septic system. I know it's opening a can of worms. That might be serious trouble, but it's the kind of thing we need to think outside the box. And speaking of which, boxes, Matt, how am I doing for time?
We are doing good. We have about 15 minutes until 5 o'clock. We don't have to go to 5, obviously, but we have plenty of time left and things. I do want to chime in on the kind of going back real quick in terms of sharing resources and the discussions about, hey, a lot of horse owners, at least here on San Juan Island, have pooled their resources together to get an east slope, usually out of Ellensburg, semi-load and a piggyback, bringing over 28, 30 tons of hay. And then that's dispersed amongst the horse owners and whatnot. Some people use island hay to supplement that as well. It's not the most cost-effective way, but it is a way. Unfortunately, now we jump into the climate is, because of last year's temperatures in the summer, those hay producers really got hit hard. I've had probably 4 or 5 horse owners call me and say, hey, do you have a supplier? Do you know anybody? So it's pretty tough in that regard, which jumps into the next section that I'm kind of jumping into is pasture management and forage production that we have here, because we can control that to a certain level and degree in terms of the quality of forage materials on our pastures, how much we can produce off that, which gets into the soil health. So everything is kind of chaining here as I go down that rabbit hole, but it's kind of a proponent to really kind of, as landowners and producers, to look at what can we do as best we can, how to increase and better manage our resources on the island. That somebody said, has anybody ever got a second cutting of hay, which isn't too common around here, but I think it can be done. Bruce and I have had long conversations in the office about how to produce, quality forage, and there's multiple ways and possibilities. And because we are where we are, we have to kind of think outside the box and really look for different alternatives that might not be the norm per se, but kind of a short, long rant in terms of we always continue to have to think and evaluate what the possibilities are and have a community discussion and help resolve each other's problems as best we can.
Thank you for that, Matt. Sarah, you're walking around with your hand up.
I am. Yeah, the hay situation is an interesting one, because those of us that have horses here that are grazing on pasture have noticed, particularly last year was really, really bad for laminitis. And so then that means we have to bring hay in from outside, because some of the fellow horse owners that I've spoken to have said island hay actually has pretty high sugar content. And so people are going for specific hays like Timothy and And that's something I've had to grapple with this year because we're moving into the spring season, which is the danger zone, and I have to try and limit my horses' access to pasture here. I just wonder if there are any management practices that can change the mix of what's, the grass we're growing in a way that keeps it so it doesn't bust out in this huge sugar frenzy.
Oh, wow. Matt or Bruce?
Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, Matt, I was going to call on you. You're the horse guy.
Okay, you're on the spot, Matt.
But I'll give it a go. And basically, Sarah, it's very difficult to change that because those forage plants are going to do what they normally do. That's their genetic propensities to do that. And yeah, it's funny because a lot of horse owners that I've talked to, don't want to buy local hay because they find it to be so pathetically poor in quality. I mean, we're talking hay that's, 5% crude protein, which might be great for some animal that doesn't need a high level performance feed. So in this case, perhaps a horse or some other livestock component that's not going through a reproductive phase. But by and large, wow. The only thing that will stop that forage from growing is the lack of water and drought or thorough kill. Matt?
Oh, I'm just, yeah, that's the $64,000 question. What can you do? Because really, I'm going to ask Andrew to chime in on this based on what he's been planning out there in terms of success and things like that. But, it really gets down to soil health and what you're doing. I mean, we do not have great soils here per se, but that's going to have a direct influence in terms of the type of forage you're going to produce and the quality of it. And that's why we here at the district really push, soil health, rotational grazing, nutrient management, species selection, whatnot. And there's never a silver bullet, unfortunately. And you're usually looking, at 5-year plans or whatever to kind of turn systems around a little bit. So what do you have? What tools? And yes, we do have management practices that can help improve those conditions. You throw the climate change issues and drought issues and things like that, and then that really kind of throw things out of whack. But we have to do something. And so we're always continually pushing people in terms of, have you done soil tests? Have you done, your composting testing in terms of applying that onto your pastures, looking at it holistically, because you really can't pull out one segment and expect the whole system to operate. It's not the best answer, but in terms of, how do we manage our lands, that's what we continually push, because that's what we have seen work. Bruce is a great example in terms of how he's managing his property down there, increasing his protein content. So we know it can work. And how do we do that? It's really, each individual farmer, landowner has their own available resources and economic constraints and whatnot. So if you want to talk more about that in terms of what you can do as a landowner, come to us and we can have more discussions in terms of what that actually might look like in terms of help you improve your own forage on your pasture conditions. And Andrew, I'm just kind of curious, because you've done so many plantings around here. What have you seen as a result of doing the no-till, and what species and any success stories that you can think of that come to mind?
Yeah, so just off the, every farm that was part of the conservation district no-till project, got to choose their own seed. So, every farm has a different goal, and but most, wanted things that were more, wanted to increase the diversity of their forage and chose things that matured at different times of the year, so that maybe they would have things green that were growing at times later in the season. And then also things that are more drought tolerant. And, you know, certain species, you know, the fast establishing species are the most successful, because just so they germinate and get established in amongst the existing grasses or the existing forage. You know, some of the slower growing things like timothy and orchard grass, you know, you can get some of those to establish, but it's much more difficult. And so, you know, something that Bruce and I had talked about is you know, it's adding varieties or adding diversity with the no-till drill is incremental change. You know, if you plant into your pasture, you know, you're not going to have a completely new system the next year. You know, it takes, sometimes I've seen some fields that take, it looks like we didn't plant anything into it, and then a year and a half later you see things planted coming in. So it takes time, and it may take multiple plantings over a number of years, but you can start shifting. You know, if there are some varieties that you know you want because you have horses or any other kind of livestock, you can start adding those in, but it's incremental change. It's gonna take time, but you can start moving in a direction that you want to go.
Great, good answers, everybody. Listen, I was mining the chat feature to see if I missed anything, and when we were talking about whole animal butchering, Rhea Miller says that we need freezer storage for that. And you know, I'm old enough to know that when you went down to get meat, you didn't go to the grocery store. You went to your cold storage locker downtown, where you had your side of beef all packed and ready. How many people remember those days? Is there a use for a community cool and or cold storage here these days? What do you think, Rhea?
I think it's a wise thing. Oops, sorry about the feedback. I think it's a wise thing to do, but I don't know if there's a market for it, but I remember it from my childhood.
Great. And Christine, is your comment about that?
It is. I'm thinking one of the sessions tomorrow is taking place at the Taproot Community Kitchen here on Lopez, and that is part of a discussion and a big survey that's actually out right now to ask people if that's something that they're interested in, if that's something that they would value, if that's something that they would pay for, either as individuals. It's a very broad survey, and so you can answer it as a producer, you could answer it as an individual family, and so freezer space, freezer storage, freezer locker storage is one component of that, as well as dry storage and humid storage and all the other kinds of storage that we know we need, you know, keeping our apples separate from our carrots kind of thing. So that is a happening topic right now.
Okay, great. I want to ask Andrew, is this about storage or a different topic?
Yeah, I had the same question about, you know, is there interest in the islands for cold storage and freezer space, and because I don't know, I have some ideas about how you could facilitate cooling using waste heat from a biochar operation. So I'm interested in the cooling, you know, using waste heat or you know, for cooling potentially. So I'm interested to know what the interest in is in the, you know, needing that, and I'm wondering if too, with if anybody,
The Gates Foundation toilet.
I have to mute.
if is cooling space a bottleneck for the food hub, or are farmers just supplying things to the food hub that have been ordered and already sold, or is, you know, is there kind of a need there?
I think Sarah Pope says that the lack of cool storage in cold and freezer space is actually hampering them. So thank you, Andrew. Marcy?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for the comments about housing, and we are hoping that this survey stimulates conversation. And specifically, Andrew brought up something I think is important just to mention is, you know, probably 99% of the type of USDA housing funding that's available is for permanent housing. And they have two different categories. One, if you're a farmer and you want it on your own farm, or two, if you want it off farm. And off farm can mean that some other farm puts up 6 units and those people work on many different farms. Or we find vacant land in town or out in the, you know, appropriately zoned area where we could build some clustered housing. So when you go through the survey, I think you'll see that we want to hear from you, what you imagine is going to work. And there's a whole scenario, seasonal, year round, different types. But there's also the ability in the survey to write in some of your creative ideas. So we really are looking for feedback. And then the second step of the survey is an interview cycle. So you have the option at the end of the survey to say, yeah, you'd like to learn more, hear more, share more. And then after that, we'll compile the data and share that with the community. But right now we're really in a listening session. So as much input as we can get gives us all a better picture of what's going on. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to the results of that survey. Hey, Brooke, is it time to wrap it up?
It is, but I just wanted to say, speaking of surveys, I shared the link from the Lopez Food and Business Center folks. So it's currently the effort is focused on Lopez, but the question also is, would you be interested in those types of services on other islands as well? So even if you're not based on Lopez, opportunity to provide input. And I think it goes to a lot of these questions of how do we aggregate or share facility and storage and things of that nature. So.
Great, thank you. And if it's brief, I think Henning had one final thing to say. Did you not?
I don't remember what it was. Lively discussion. I did have comments all along, but I didn't always raise my hand.
All right, thank you. I could turn it back to Matt. Matt, you want to wrap it up?
I shall. Great discussion. Thank you, everybody. As usual, these roundtables are fairly illuminated a lot of different ideas and people's experiences and how they're solving problems and approaching their day-to-day operations and things like that. So cannot stress the importance of talking to your neighbor over the fence line or even on Zoom, having a cup of tea, whatever the case may be. So continue sharing those resources and ideas. And there are some common themes, some new themes, and some old themes. But keep on doing what we're doing. So it's 5 o'clock, we're wrapping up. The keynote speaker is tonight at 5:30. It's rematriation, restoring. Ugh, I'm had it for today. Again, rematriation, restoring the land through centering Indigenous relationships. So real briefly, it's join Mohawk seed keeper Rowan White in an hour of virtual storytelling, inquiry, and invitation in the movement of Indigenous land and seed.